People said the tape never existed. No catalog number, no studio log, no producer credit. Nothing that proved it had ever been recorded. The story moved quietly, through small circles of collectors and engineers like a rumor that refused to die. One aging session guitarist once claimed he heard it just once, late one night, in a studio in Los Angeles, but whenever someone asked him about it later, he would simply shake his head and say he must have imagined it. Because what he heard that night didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like a confession. And according to the few people who were there, when Elvis Presley finished singing that song, no one in the room clapped. No one even moved. They just sat there in silence, as if something in the air had shifted and none of them knew how to breathe normally again. It was well past midnight on Sunset Boulevard inside a small recording studio that hardly anyone famous used anymore. It wasn't one of the grand polished studios where Elvis usually worked. This place was older, quieter, and carried the smell of dust, warm tape machines, and cigarette smoke soaked deep into the walls after years of late-night sessions. The kind of studio musicians rented when they didn't want attention. The kind of place chosen when the song wasn't meant for the world. The engineer on duty that night was a quiet man, named Robert Hale. He had spent most of his career behind glass panels adjusting levels for artists who came and went like passing storms. Nothing surprised him anymore. At least that's what he believed until the phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m. The voice on the other end spoke, calmly and briefly. "Mr. Presley is coming in tonight. No paperwork, no questions." Then the line went dead. Hale sat there staring at the receiver for several seconds, unsure whether someone had just played a joke on him. Artists didn't book sessions like that. Not someone like Elvis. Not without assistants, producers, or managers involved. Yet 40 minutes later, the quiet street outside the studio filled with the soft rumble of a car engine. Hale glanced through the window and saw a long black Cadillac slowly pull to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped Elvis Presley himself. But he didn't look like the Elvis the world recognized. There was no flashy stage suit, no crowd-pleasing smile, no playful swagger. He wore a simple dark shirt with the collar slightly open, and his hair looked less carefully styled than usual. His expression was calm but distant, as if his mind was somewhere far away from the street he was standing on. When he walked toward the studio entrance, he didn't look around or wave to anyone. He moved quietly, like someone entering a church late at night. Inside the control room, Robert Hale quickly stood to greet him. "Good evening, Mr. Presley," he said politely. "What are we recording tonight?" Elvis paused at the doorway and looked through the glass toward the empty studio floor. A single microphone stood beneath a dim overhead light. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he spoke softly. "Just a song." Hale waited for more details, but none came. After a few seconds, Elvis added, "One take. That's all." No band arrived. No backup singers followed him in. No one carried sheet music or instruments through the door. Elvis had come completely alone. That alone made the night feel unusual, but there was something else in his voice too. Something quieter, heavier. Hale led him toward the recording room while adjusting the equipment. At the center of the studio stood an old RCA ribbon microphone. One Elvis had always liked because it captured warmth in the voice that newer microphones sometimes lost. Elvis stepped up to it and rested his hands loosely together in front of him. Through the glass, Hale checked the meters and prepared the tape reels. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the machines warming up. "Whenever you're ready," Hale said through the intercom. Elvis nodded once. The reels began to spin. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The silence stretched so long that Hale wondered if Elvis had changed his mind. Then Elvis leaned closer to the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper. "This one ain't for the charts," he said quietly. The words sent an unexpected chill through Hale's arms. Then Elvis closed his eyes and began to sing. What came out of that microphone didn't sound like the powerful voice that had filled stadiums and radio stations around the world. It was softer, almost fragile. There was no dramatic vibrato, no polished performance technique. The melody moved slowly, carried more by emotion than precision. It sounded less like a recorded song and more like someone reading lines from a personal diary they never meant to share. Hale found himself slowly removing his hands from the controls, because he didn't want to disturb the moment. Every word felt heavy with meaning. Halfway through the first verse, Elvis's voice cracked slightly. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't something an audience would normally notice, but Hale heard it clearly through the headphones. The strange thing was that Elvis didn't stop or redo the line. He simply kept going, letting the crack remain exactly as it was. That was the moment Hale realized this wasn't really a performance anymore. Elvis wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to release something he had been carrying for a very long time. By the time the second verse began, it felt obvious that Elvis wasn't singing for an audience at all. He was singing to someone who wasn't in the room, someone who couldn't hear him anymore. The lyrics hinted at regret and memories that had followed him through years of fame and noise. It sounded like a man, looking backward through his own life and finally saying the things he never said when there was still time. The studio felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had leaned closer to listen. When the final chorus arrived, Elvis didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped slightly away from the microphone and sang even softer than before, almost like he was afraid someone outside the room might overhear the words. The last line hung in the air for a moment, and then faded into silence. The tape reels continued spinning for 3 more seconds. No one spoke. Elvis slowly opened his eyes and stepped back from the microphone. Then he looked through the glass at Robert Hale and said 2 quiet words that would change everything about that night. "Erase it." Hale blinked, certain he had misheard. "Sir?" Elvis walked calmly into the control room, his expression steady but firm. "I just needed to sing it once," he said. "Now erase the tape." Hale felt a strange weight settle in his stomach as he looked down at the spinning reels. In his hands was a recording no one outside this room had ever heard. A moment of raw honesty from the most famous singer in the world. And Elvis Presley wanted it gone forever. The tape kept spinning between them, the reels turning slowly as if time itself refused to stop. Robert Hale looked down at the machine and then back at Elvis Presley standing quietly in the control room. The silence felt heavier than the music that had filled the studio just moments ago. Hale had recorded thousands of songs in his career, but never had he felt something like this sitting on a reel of magnetic tape. What Elvis had just sung didn't sound like a hit record. It didn't sound like something meant for radio or crowds or applause. It sounded like a secret someone had finally spoken aloud after carrying it for years. Hale cleared his throat slowly. "Mr. Presley, are you sure?" he asked carefully. Elvis didn't answer right away. He turned his head and looked through the glass window toward the dark studio floor, where the microphone still stood, alone under the light. For a moment he seemed somewhere else entirely, like a man replaying memories only he could see. Then he nodded once. "I meant what I said," Elvis replied quietly. "Erase it." Hale's fingers hovered over the controls, but he didn't move. Engineers were trained to preserve recordings, not destroy them. Every session, every take, every small moment of sound could become history someday. And the voice sitting on that tape belonged to one of the most famous musicians alive. Hale imagined what collectors decades later would pay just to hear something like this. But the man who had created that moment was standing right in front of him, asking for it to disappear forever. Elvis leaned lightly against the console, his expression calm but tired. "You ever say something out loud?" he asked slowly. "Just so you don't have to carry it anymore?" Hale looked up at him. The question didn't sound like something meant for an engineer. It sounded like something a man asks another, man late at night when the truth feels easier than silence. Hale nodded once. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Elvis glanced back toward the studio again. "That song was that," he murmured. The words hung in the air like the echo of the performance that had just ended. Hale suddenly understood something important. The song had never been meant for an audience. It wasn't written for records or concerts or fans waiting outside arenas. It was something personal, something buried, maybe a memory, maybe a regret, maybe words meant for someone who could no longer hear them. The tape continued spinning gently, capturing the quiet breathing of the room itself. Hale stared at it, knowing that inside that thin ribbon of magnetic tape lived something incredibly rare. The unfiltered voice of Elvis Presley, without the stage, without the fame, without the image the world expected him to be. Just a man speaking through music. "It was remarkable," Hale finally said, almost apologetically. Elvis shook his head slightly. "No," he said softly. "It was honest." That single word seemed to explain everything. Fame had given Elvis many things: crowds, records, headlines, but honesty was something the world rarely allowed famous people to show. Every performance had to be bigger, louder, brighter. But what Hale had heard tonight was the opposite of that. It was quiet, fragile, almost private. Elvis straightened and looked at the machine again. "Go ahead," he said. "Stop the tape." Hale slowly reached toward the console. His fingers touched the metal switch, but he didn't press it yet. In that moment, he realized he was holding something that might never exist again. A recording of Elvis Presley not as a legend, but as a human being, standing alone in a room at midnight, telling the truth through a melody no one else was supposed to hear. He wondered if history would ever forgive him for destroying it. The reels kept spinning softly. Finally, Hale pressed the stop button. The machine clicked and the tape came to rest. The room became completely silent. Elvis exhaled slowly, almost like a man setting down a heavy weight he had been carrying for years. For the first time that night, a faint smile appeared on his face. It wasn't the bright, confident smile the public knew. It was quieter than that. Relieved. "Thank you," he said simply. Hale nodded, but his eyes remained on the tape. "What should I do with it?" he asked. Elvis thought for a moment. Then he reached forward and gently removed the reel from the machine. He held it in his hands, studying it like someone looking at a photograph from long ago. "Sometimes a song isn't meant to last forever," he said softly. "Sometimes it just needs to exist for a moment." Hale watched as Elvis carefully placed the tape back on the desk. For several seconds, neither man moved. "That's enough." Then he stepped out of the control room and walked down the hallway toward the exit. A minute later, the door closed softly behind him. Outside, the black Cadillac engine started and disappeared into the sleeping streets of Los Angeles. Robert Hale remained alone in the studio. The empty microphone still stood under the light. The tape sat silently on the desk beside him. Hale looked at it for a long time. He remembered every word of the song already, every fragile note, every crack in Elvis's voice. Finally, he reached forward and lifted the reel once more. For a moment, it looked like he might follow Elvis's instructions exactly, but instead of destroying it, he carefully placed it inside a plain, unmarked box and slid it into the back of a cabinet. Years later, collectors would argue endlessly about whether the recording had ever existed at all. There was no paperwork, no official record, no proof, just whispers passed between engineers and musicians who claimed someone had heard a song Elvis Presley once sang in the middle of the night, a song that was never meant for anyone else. And somewhere in the quiet darkness of an old studio cabinet, a reel of tape waited silently, still holding the voice of a man who only needed the world to hear him once.